Hello there and welcome. Tonight, allow me to take you by the hand and lead you gently into a place where time drifts like a slow river and the noise of the day fades into soft, distant echoes. This will be a quiet journey, a long and unhurried walk through the shadowed corridors of the past. Along the way, we will meet figures whose names have been almost forgotten, yet whose lives once shimmered brightly in their own time. We will visit places where the walls seem to breathe with memory, where every stone holds the weight of countless untold stories. The tale I'm about to tell you is one of love and loss, ambition and quiet surrender. It begins not with the sound of trumpets or the flare of a grand announcement, but with a soft whisper, the kind that slips through the air just before night settles fully over the land. It is the story of a woman named Elowen Hart, born in a small harbour town that always smelled faintly of salt and cedar. Her life, like so many others, might have passed unnoticed if not for a single choice, a choice that would ripple outwards across years, carrying with it the delicate threads of fate. Our setting is the year 1883. The sea was everything to the town of Greystone, a place where the cries of gulls marked the hours more reliably than the church bell. Wooden ships lined the harbour like restless giants tethered to their moorings, and the fishermen's voices, rough yet familiar, rose in the damp morning air. Here, life followed the steady rhythm of tides and seasons, predictable if you knew how to listen. Elowen's family owned a small bookshop that stood at the corner of Main Street and the harbour road. The door chimed with the arrival of customers, though in truth, it was often empty for hours. The wooden floors creaked under the weight of the years, and the smell inside was a mix of dust, ink, and sea air that had wandered in through the half-open windows. Elowen grew up surrounded by shelves that seemed impossibly tall, filled with stories of faraway cities, ancient empires, and adventures she could only dream of. Her father believed that books were ships for the mind, each one able to carry you further than any vessel in the harbour. In the autumn of her 22nd year, something changed. It was a season of heavier rains when the sea grew darker and the gulls flew closer to the shore. On one such grey afternoon, a stranger entered the shop. He was dressed in a long coat, his collar turned up against the wind, and his boots still wet with seawater. He moved slowly among the shelves, his fingers trailing across the spines as though they were old friends. His name was Elias Mercer, and he carried with him the air of someone who had travelled far, not only in distance but in the landscapes of the Hart. He purchased a single volume, a weathered atlas, its pages marked with ink notes from an unknown hand. As Elowen wrapped it in brown paper, he studied her with quiet curiosity, as though he recognised something in her that even she did not yet know. That night, Elowen lay awake listening to the rain against her window. The town outside was silent except for the rhythmic push and pull of the tide. Something about Elias lingered in her thoughts, not his appearance, though his face was striking in a solemn sort of way, but rather the feeling that his arrival was no accident. In the days that followed, he returned. Sometimes he bought a book, sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he simply stood at the counter, asking her questions about the town's history or about the ships that came and went in the harbour. His voice was low and even, each word measured. There was a patience in him, as if he was content to wait for the world to reveal its secrets in its own time. Gradually, Elowen began to learn fragments about his life. He was a cartographer, a maker of maps, though not for any merchant company or naval fleet. His work, he explained, was of a more personal nature, to chart the forgotten, the half-remembered, the places that did not always appear on official records. Some called them myths, but to Elias, they were simply places the world had chosen to hide. It was during one such conversation that he mentioned a name she had never heard before, the Island of Gwyndral. His tone when he spoke of it was almost reverent, as though uttering a prayer. He claimed it lay somewhere beyond the known shipping lanes, veiled in mist and memory. Few believed it was real, but Elias had reasons, maps and stories enough to convince himself otherwise. Elowen found herself drawn into his quiet fervour. Night after night, she read through the shop's collection of maritime records, scanning for any mention of the place. She found hints, a captain's log here, a passing reference in an explorer's journal there, but nothing that placed it firmly on the map. Outside, winter began to press in. The sea turned restless, waves striking the breakwater with a force that sent plumes of salt spray high into the air. The lanterns along the harbour road burned a little dimmer, their light struggling against the fog. Inside the shop, Elias lingered more often, his presence becoming as much a part of the place as the scent of the old books. And then, one evening, he made an offer that would change the course of her life. He was leaving in the spring, he said, to search for Gwyndral. He had a berth on a vessel, provisions enough for months, and a map that might, just might, lead them there. He wanted her to come. Elowen stared at him, the words folding themselves into the quiet space between them. Outside, the rain began again, tapping softly against the glass as though urging her to decide. Elowen did not answer Elias that night. The idea of leaving Greystone was not one she could take lightly. Her entire life had been built upon the steady pulse of the harbour tides, the comfort of the bookshop's walls, and the familiar paths between home and sea. To abandon all that, even for a time, felt like stepping into a void without knowing whether there was solid ground beneath. Yet, in the days that followed, his invitation seemed to live in the corners of her mind. She found herself staring out of the shop's fogged windows for longer than usual, wondering what it might be like to see the horizon not as the end of her world, but as the start of another. She began to notice how many of the books she loved most were about journeys, the kind that began with a single step away from the known. The townsfolk had their own opinions about Elias. Most saw him as a polite if unusual visitor, a man who kept to himself, who appeared to be listening even when no one was speaking. Some whispered that he had the look of someone who'd left something behind. Others thought him a dreamer chasing illusions across a map. None of them, however, doubted that he was a man who belonged to the sea more than to the land. One afternoon, the sky hung low and heavy with a curtain of pale mist. Elias came to the shop carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He placed it gently on the counter and began unwrapping it. Inside was a map unlike any Elowen had ever seen. It was drawn on thick, yellowed vellum, the ink faded in places, but still legible. Delicate lines traced coastlines and islands, some with names she recognised, others labelled in an unfamiliar hand. But it was the far right edge of the map that caught her attention. There, sketched in faint strokes, was an island shrouded in waves and clouds. "This," Elias said softly, "is where I believe Gwyndral lies." The map bore no compass rose, no scale. Instead, tiny notes in a language she could not read clustered around certain points. He explained that it had been given to him years ago by an old mariner in a port far from Greystone, a man who claimed to have seen Gwyndral once, only to lose sight of it in a sudden fog. The mariner had spoken of high cliffs that shone white under the moon, forests where the leaves glimmered like glass, and a silence deeper than any he had known at sea. Elowen traced the island's outline with the tip of her finger. She could feel her pulse quicken, as though the very thought of the place reached into her chest. But the practical part of her still hesitated. "And if it doesn't exist?" she asked. "Then," Elias replied, "we will have seen waters few others have sailed, and we will return with a story no one else can tell." That night, Elowen found it impossible to sleep. She sat by the small oil lamp in her room, staring at the stacks of books on her desk. She thought of her father, who had passed 3 winters ago, and how he used to say that every life was a map, some with wide oceans, some with narrow rivers, and some with both. She wondered what her own map looked like, and whether it had any unexplored edges left. By morning, she had made her decision. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations. Elias visited the harbour to speak with the captain who would take them, a weathered man named Barrow, whose ship, the Selkie, was built for long voyages. Elowen packed carefully, choosing only what she could carry without burden. A small trunk would hold her clothes, a leather-bound journal, and 3 books she could not leave behind. Word of her departure spread quickly. Some friends urged her to reconsider, warning her about the dangers of the open sea. Others smiled knowingly, as though they had always suspected she was meant for something beyond Greystone's shore. The shop was left in the care of a cousin who promised to keep its doors open until she returned. The night before their departure, Elias came to see her. They stood together outside the shop, the air crisp with the last breath of winter. The harbour lamps flickered against the dark, and the water shifted restlessly. "Once we leave," he said quietly, "there is no promise of when or if we'll return." Elowen looked at the ships bobbing in the dim light. "I know," she replied, "and still I want to go." At dawn, the town gathered to watch as the Selkie prepared to sail. The deck creaked under the weight of barrels and crates, ropes groaned as they tightened, and the crew moved with the efficient quiet of those who had done this countless times. Elowen stood beside Elias, the chill wind tugging at her coat, and felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. As the ship eased away from the dock, the sound of the harbour faded. The gulls circled overhead, their cries growing distant. She kept her eyes on the line where sea met sky, a horizon that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Greystone shrank behind them until it was little more than a blur, then disappeared altogether into the morning mist. For the first time in her life, Elowen was leaving the map she had always known, stepping into blank space where only imagination and the pull of an uncharted island guided the way. The Selkie cut steadily through the water, its sails swelling with the wind like pale wings. The air out here was different, sharper, colder, and somehow cleaner, as though every breath washed away traces of the land they had left behind. The rhythmic groan of the timbers and the soft hiss of the waves against the hull began to weave themselves into the background of Elowen's thoughts. Life aboard the ship was at once simple and strange. The crew were men hardened by years at sea, their faces weathered and their eyes bright with a kind of restless knowledge. They rose before dawn, their movements precise and wordless as they trimmed sails, coiled ropes, and checked the compass fixed near the wheel. Elias, though not a sailor himself, moved easily among them, his questions brief and his silences even more telling. Captain Barrow was a man of few words. He had a presence that seemed to command without effort, the sort of authority built not on force but on the quiet certainty of experience. His beard was silvered and his voice low, yet when he spoke, every ear turned to listen. It was clear he had agreed to this voyage, not for profit, but out of a curiosity that mirrored Elias's own. Elowen found her place quickly, though her tasks were small. She spent hours on deck, helping to tidy lines, polishing brass, or carrying messages between the galley and the helm. More often than not, she found herself simply watching, the way the sea shifted from green to deep cobalt, the way the sky stretched endlessly above, and the way the horizon seemed to breathe, rising and falling with the swells. At night, the ship became a place of shadows and whispers. The lanterns swung gently with the motion of the waves, casting shifting halos of light across the deck. Elias often joined her near the bow, where they would lean over the railing and listen to the dark water beneath. Sometimes he would speak of places he had seen, a chain of volcanic islands where the sand was black as coal, a hidden lagoon whose water glowed faintly under the moon, a coast where cliffs rose higher than the tallest cathedral. Other times he spoke of Gwyndral. He told her the legends, of sailors who heard music across the water long before land came into view, of lights that moved through the forest like living stars, of an air so still that even the waves seemed to hesitate before touching its shores. Each story carried a thread of wonder, but also an undertone of warning, as if the island was not meant to be found by everyone. The days slipped by, marked only by the sun's slow arc across the sky. They passed fishing boats, distant merchant vessels, and the occasional flock of seabirds that followed for a time before vanishing into the clouds. The further they sailed, the fewer signs of the familiar world remained. The stars at night grew brighter, sharper, as though they had been waiting for them beyond the reach of the shore. One evening, the wind shifted suddenly. The crew moved quickly, tightening lines and adjusting sails as the Selkie leaned into the gust. Clouds gathered on the horizon, dark, rolling masses that swallowed the fading light. Captain Barrow gave quiet orders, his eyes scanning the sky. The storm came fast. The first drops of rain were cold and sharp, carried on a wind that seemed to howl from every direction at once. The deck tilted beneath their feet as the waves rose, striking the hull with deep, resonant booms. Elowen clung to the railing, her coat plastered to her skin, her hair whipping across her face. Through it all, Elias was near, moving between crew members to secure what might be lost. Lightning tore across the clouds, revealing the vast, heaving surface of the sea. For a moment, Elowen felt as though they had been lifted into a place beyond the world she knew, a place where time and direction meant nothing. The storm raged deep into the night until at last it began to fade. The rain softened to a mist, the wind fell into a whisper, and the waves sank back into a steady rhythm. By morning, the sea was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But the air felt different, and so did the light, paler, more diffuse, as though the world had shifted subtly while they were lost inside the storm. It was then that Elias came to her, a small salt-stained notebook in his hands. He opened it to a page where an unfamiliar pattern of lines and circles was drawn. "We've crossed into waters that don't appear on any official charts," he said quietly. "From here on, every mile takes us closer to what we're looking for, or further into the unknown." Elowen looked out over the endless expanse, her heart caught between the steady pull of curiosity and the quiet hum of unease. Somewhere beyond that horizon, perhaps hidden in the pale haze, lay the island that had pulled them from their safe harbours, and now it felt closer than ever. The days after the storm carried with them an unfamiliar stillness. The sea lay flat and glassy beneath a washed-out sky, its surface so calm that the Selkie seemed to glide without effort. Even the wind had softened, moving only enough to keep the sails breathing. It was as though they had entered a waiting place, a stretch of ocean holding its breath. The crew felt it too. Their voices grew quieter, their laughter less frequent. Work was still done with the same precision, but there was an unspoken awareness that each passing hour brought them deeper into waters untouched by familiar trade routes. No other ships crossed their path now, and the distant lines of seabirds that had once followed them had vanished entirely. Elias spent long hours with his charts, comparing the faint markings on the old vellum map to the stars overhead and the shifting patterns of the currents. He often invited Elowen to join him, pointing out constellations that would guide them through the night. Some of these she knew: Orion, Cassiopeia, the North Star, but others he named in ways she had never heard before, as if drawing from a language older than any in her books. At night, the sea seemed to absorb every sound: the slap of the waves against the hull, the creak of the rigging, even the murmur of voices. All of it felt muted, as though the world had been wrapped in layers of soft cloth. It was in that hush that Elowen began to notice something strange. At times, when she leaned over the railing and looked into the dark water, faint points of light glimmered far below, shifting and winking like distant stars. The first time she mentioned it, Elias simply nodded, as though he had expected her to see it eventually. "Bioluminescence," he said, "but not like the kind near the coasts. Out here, some say the light runs deeper." Almost as if the ocean remembers the sky. His tone made her wonder if it was more he wasn't telling her. 2 nights later, under a pale crescent moon, the crew spotted something unusual on the horizon. A faint glow, low and hazy, that didn't belong to the moon or the stars. Captain Barrow studied it for a long time before speaking. "Could be an island," he said at last, "or it could be nothing at all." His words hung in the air, neither hopeful nor dismissive, as though he knew that at sea, both possibilities carried equal weight. By morning, the glow had faded, replaced by a dense rolling fog that swallowed the horizon entirely. It pressed in close, so thick that Elowen could barely see from one end of the deck to the other. The Selkie slowed, the crew moving with deliberate care, their eyes fixed on the shifting grey. The fog seemed alive in its movement. At times it swirled in delicate spirals, at others it drifted in heavy sheets, curling around the masts and slipping into every gap between ropes and sails. The air grew cooler, damp enough to bead on skin, and every sound seemed both muffled and strangely amplified. The splash of water against the hull, the sigh of the wind in the rigging, the low call of the lookout above. It was during that muted passage that Elowen felt the first true ripple of unease. Standing near the bow, she thought she heard something. A faint, almost melodic hum threading through the air. It was soft enough that she wondered if it was only in her mind, but the more she listened, the more certain she became. The sound seemed to come from no particular direction, carried by the fog itself. When she told Elias, he listened intently, his expression unreadable. "There are stories," he said slowly, "of voices carried over water. Not human, not entirely natural, but something in between." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press him. Some questions, she sensed, were better left unanswered until the right moment. By the third day, the fog began to lift in slow, reluctant veils. Shapes returned to the horizon, the faint outline of waves, the long arc of the sky. But something else emerged too, far ahead, barely visible, a dark shape rising from the water. It was too distant to make out clearly, but its presence was undeniable. The crew gathered quietly along the rail, eyes fixed on the shape. Elias stood beside Elowen, the old map folded in his hand, his gaze sharpened with a mix of anticipation and caution. "If that is what I think it is," he murmured, "then we've found our first proof." Elowen's pulse quickened. The island, if it was an island, lay still on the horizon, unmoving despite the shifting water around it. And though it was far, she felt the unmistakable pull of something waiting there, as though the sea itself had been guiding them toward it all along. As the dark shape ahead grew clearer, the air aboard the Selkie seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a sharper edge to the wind, a faint scent she could not place, something neither wholly of the sea nor the land. The crew worked in near silence, their eyes drawn again and again to the looming form that broke the horizon. Even Captain Barrow, who rarely betrayed surprise, lingered longer than usual at the wheel, his gaze locked forward. By midday, the outline had sharpened into the jagged rise of cliffs. They stood stark and grey against the pale sky, their faces streaked with lines of white where seabirds wheeled in slow arcs. At the base of those cliffs, waves foamed and broke in bursts of spray. No harbour or beach was visible, only a sheer wall of stone that seemed to declare the island's unwillingness to receive visitors. Elias studied it with a quiet intensity, his map open and one finger tracing the faded lines. "This matches what little I've been able to piece together," he murmured to Elowen. "But the accounts say the island shifts, that what you see first may not be the place itself, but a barrier, a guardian of sorts." They skirted the cliffs at a cautious distance, searching for any sign of a break in the rock. The afternoon light deepened, shadows pooling in the crevices high above. From time to time, the sound of the waves striking stone rose to a booming echo, like distant thunder. Then, as they rounded a sharp bend in the coastline, Elowen saw it, a narrow cleft in the rock just wide enough for a small vessel to pass through. It was hidden from most angles, cloaked in shadow until the Selkie drew near. The water inside the cleft was darker, almost black, and the air that drifted from within was cooler than the wind on the open sea. Captain Barrow slowed the ship, consulting with Elias in low tones. The decision to enter was not made lightly. The tide was shifting, and the passage between the cliffs would be treacherous if the current turned against them. Still, after a brief silence, the captain gave the order. The Selkie eased into the narrow channel. The cliffs rose high on either side, shutting out much of the light. The cries of seabirds faded, replaced by the deep, hollow sound of water lapping against the rock. Elowen gripped the railing, feeling the temperature drop further as they passed deeper into shadow. The air smelled faintly of earth and something older, harder to name, a scent that stirred a memory she could not place. Halfway through the channel, a strange thing happened. The water beneath them began to glow. It was faint at first, a pale blue shimmer that traced the ripples along the hull. But as they moved forward, the glow deepened, spilling into the depths like liquid light. The crew murmured in awe, some crossing themselves, others simply staring down into the luminous water. Elias leaned over the rail, his eyes reflecting the glow. "This isn't on any chart," he whispered. "It's not in the accounts either. Which means..." He trailed off, as if the rest of the thought was for him alone. When at last they emerged from the channel, the sea opened into a sheltered bay. The water here was impossibly clear, the sandy bottom visible even at great depth. Towering trees lined the shore, their leaves catching the light in flashes of green and silver. The air was still, save for the slow, rhythmic sound of the tide breathing against the land. It was unlike any place Elowen had ever seen. The colours were sharper, the shadows deeper, the light itself warmer, as though the island existed in a world just slightly apart from their own. For a long while, no one spoke. Even the captain stood motionless, one hand resting on the wheel. Finally, Elias turned to her, his voice low but steady. "Welcome to Gwyndral." They anchored near the shore, lowering the longboat to carry them to land. As the oars dipped into the glowing water, Elowen felt a tension she hadn't realised she was holding begin to shift. Yet beneath the wonder was something else. A quiet awareness that whatever they had found here was not a final destination, but the opening of a door. The sand was cool beneath her boots when she stepped onto the island. The forest before them seemed to breathe, the leaves rustling in a pattern that felt more deliberate than the random touch of the wind. Somewhere deeper inside, a faint sound rose. Not the hum she had heard in the fog, but something more intricate, like the beginning of a song carried on the air. She glanced at Elias and saw that he had heard it too. The first steps into the forest felt like crossing an unseen threshold. The air shifted, warmer now, thick with the scent of earth and flowering plants that Elowen could not name. Shafts of light pierced the canopy, catching on leaves that seemed to hold a metallic sheen, flashing silver when the wind touched them. The ground was soft underfoot, a rich layer of moss and fallen petals muffling their footsteps until it seemed they were moving in silence. The trees themselves were unlike any Elowen had seen before. Their trunks rose in smooth columns pale as driftwood, and their branches spread high above like the ribs of a great vaulted ceiling. From these branches hung strands of something between vine and light, thin, translucent threads that glowed faintly even in the day. When she brushed her fingers against one, it trembled like a living thing and released a faint note, soft and bell-like. Elias was moving slowly, scanning their surroundings with the careful eyes of someone who had spent his life studying maps but rarely walked the places he charted. Every so often he would pause, jotting something into his notebook or leaning close to examine markings carved into tree trunks. These markings were unfamiliar to Elowen, looping shapes and intersecting lines, their edges smoothed with age. Captain Barrow and 2 crewmen carried the supplies they'd brought ashore. They kept close, their eyes wary, glancing often into the deeper shadows between the trees. It was not fear exactly, but a guardedness, as though they knew instinctively that this place demanded respect. After some time, they came to a clearing. At its centre stood a pool of water so still that it mirrored the sky perfectly. Around its edge grew tall, reed-like plants, topped with flowers shaped like small lanterns. As the group approached, the flowers swayed, though no wind touched them, and the water gave off a faint scent of salt, despite its inland position. Elowen knelt at the edge, dipping her hand into the pool. The water was cool, but as her fingers moved through it, she felt a strange resistance, not quite like touching a solid surface, but as if the water itself recognised her presence. She withdrew her hand quickly, the droplets on her skin catching the sunlight in tiny iridescent colours. Elias crouched beside her, his expression thoughtful. "This pool," he said quietly, "matches one of the oldest descriptions I've read of Gwyndral. A meeting place, they called it, but for whom, no one could say." As they rested there, a sound drifted through the clearing, low at first, then rising in delicate patterns. It was the same intricate tone Elowen had heard from the edge of the forest, only now it was stronger, layered with harmonies that seemed impossible for any single instrument or voice to produce. It came from somewhere beyond the pool, where the trees grew denser and the light dimmed. Without speaking, they rose and followed the sound. The path narrowed, winding between roots as thick as a person's waist. The air grew cooler again, and the faint glow from the hanging threads among the branches became more pronounced, casting pale light over their faces. Eventually, they reached a place where the forest opened into a wide circle. At the centre stood a formation of stone pillars, weathered and covered in moss. They were arranged in a precise pattern, though what it represented was unclear. Between the pillars, the ground was marked with shallow grooves, as though water had once flowed there in carefully guided streams. The sound was clearer here, though still without a visible source. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding them in a way that made Elowen's chest tighten with a mix of wonder and unease. She noticed that the crewmen had stepped back toward the edges of the clearing, their gazes lowered, as if reluctant to be too close. Elias moved slowly among the stones, tracing the moss-covered carvings with his fingertips. These aren't just decorative, he murmured. They're coordinates. Not in the way we'd use them at sea, but in relation to something else. Something not fixed on any map. Elowen turned slowly, letting her eyes take in the entire circle. The pillars, the grooves in the ground, the subtle alignment of the trees around them, it all felt deliberate, as if the entire space had been shaped to serve a purpose. She could not yet name what that purpose was, but the air here carried the weight of intent, as though countless moments had unfolded in this place long before their arrival. And then, just as she was beginning to think the sound might never reveal its source, the faintest movement caught her eye. A figure, barely visible in the shifting light, standing at the far edge of the clearing. The figure stood very still, almost blending into the pale trunks and silvered leaves behind it. At first, Elowen thought her eyes were playing tricks on her, that it was simply another pillar half hidden by the forest's shadows. But then the light shifted and she saw the faint outline of a cloak, the curve of a shoulder, the quiet tilt of a head. Elias noticed her gaze and followed it. His hands stilled on the surface of the nearest pillar, his body tensing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. The crewman, sensing the change in the air, glanced toward the trees but made no move forward. Captain Barrow, standing slightly apart, rested one hand on the hilt of his knife, not in aggression but readiness. The figure took a single step forward, the movement fluid and deliberate. The cloak, or perhaps it was a long woven garment, shimmered faintly in the dim light, its fabric carrying the same silvery sheen as the forest leaves. No face was visible beneath the hood, but Elowen felt the weight of its attention settle on them. When it spoke, the voice was neither male nor female, but a calm, measured tone that carried easily across the clearing without seeming to rise in volume. The words were in a language Elowen did not know, soft and winding, as if shaped by the same currents that moved the trees above. Elias listened intently, his brows drawing together, but he did not answer immediately. After a pause, the figure spoke again, slower this time, the syllables more deliberate. Elias stepped forward, stopping just short of the central groove that marked the heart of the stone formation. "We mean no harm," he said, his own voice low but steady. "We've come seeking knowledge, to understand this place." There was a long silence. The figure tilted its head slightly, then lifted one hand. In that gesture, something small and luminous glimmered between its fingers, a shard of stone, no larger than a coin, glowing faintly from within. It placed the shard into the groove at its feet, and at once the faint hum that had surrounded the clearing deepened, spreading outward like a ripple through water. The grooves in the ground began to glow with the same soft light, the pattern spreading from the stone toward the centre of the formation. The pillars caught the glow next, the carvings Elias had traced earlier lighting up in lines of pale fire. The effect was not harsh or blinding, but warm, like moonlight reflected on still water. Elowen's breath caught. The entire clearing now felt alive, every surface carrying the pulse of something unseen yet undeniably present. The figure stepped back, fading once more toward the edge of the trees, but the light remained. Elias turned to her, his eyes bright with both awe and a trace of something she had not seen in him before. Uncertainty. This is a map," he murmured, "but not of land, not of sea, of connections, pathways." He gestured toward the glowing lines. "It's as if the island itself is charted here, but in layers. Some we can walk, others we can't." The humming tone shifted then, becoming more intricate, like many voices weaving together. The light in the grooves brightened briefly, then dimmed until it was gone, leaving only the faint glow of the stone shard where it had been placed. The air seemed heavier now, as though whatever had just occurred had left the clearing changed. Without another word, the figure turned and disappeared into the forest, moving in such a way that the trees seemed to swallow it whole. Not a single leaf stirred in its wake. For a long while, no one spoke. Even the crewmen, who had remained at a careful distance, seemed rooted to the spot. Elowen felt a strange mix of awe and unease swirling in her chest, the sense that they had been shown something important, but not told what it meant. Elias finally straightened, closing his notebook with deliberate care. "We'll need to come back here," he said softly. "This was an invitation of some kind. And I don't think we've yet seen the Heart of Gwyndral." The forest beyond the clearing seemed darker now, the silver light of the hanging threads faint against the deepening shadows. Somewhere in that darkness, Elowen thought she heard the echo of the voice again. Not speaking this time, but singing, the melody winding away into the unseen depths of the island. They left the stone circle in silence, following the narrow trail back toward the bay. The forest seemed to have grown denser in their absence, the trunks pressing closer together, the silver-threaded vines swaying faintly, as if stirred by an unseen hand. Elowen felt the weight of the clearing still in her mind, the glow of the grooves, the hum in the air, the presence of the cloaked figure. Elias walked ahead, his notebook held tight at his side, though he didn't pause to write. His steps were deliberate, almost measured to the rhythm of his thoughts. Captain Barrow kept to the rear with the two crewmen, their gazes shifting often toward the shadows, watchful but not openly tense. The path was narrow enough that they had to walk single file. Elowen found herself glancing off into either side, drawn to the faint, strange details of the forest. A knot in a tree shaped like an eye, a patch of moss that shimmered faintly when touched by light, the brief flicker of something darting between the roots ahead. At times she thought she heard whispers just at the edge of hearing, not in the language the figure had spoken, but something softer, like the rustle of distant leaves. When they reached the bay, the sight of the Selkie bobbing gently in the clear water was almost a comfort. The ship looked unchanged, a piece of the world they had left behind, but even from here the island's presence clung to the air. The sky above was tinted with a faint gold, though the sun was not yet setting, as if the light here bent to its own rules. Back aboard, the crew busied themselves with checking supplies, lowering casks into the water to fill with fresh spring runoff from the island and preparing the galley for an evening meal. Yet the usual banter was absent. Men worked quietly, and when they spoke it was in low tones. News of the glowing water in the channel and the strange music in the forest had spread quickly, and each man seemed to carry his own interpretation of what it meant. Elias finally joined Elowen at the stern, his expression shadowed but not grim. "This island isn't uninhabited," he said simply. "That figure wasn't a guardian in the way I expected. More, a messenger, which means there's something deeper inland, something or someone they want us to find." Elowen studied the tree line where the silver-lit leaves shifted in the soft wind. "Do you think they mean to help us? Or keep us from something?" Elias's eyes remained on the forest. "Both, perhaps. Some places don't give up their secrets freely, but they don't always shut you out completely either. You're allowed in, but only so far as they wish." The evening passed in a quiet rhythm. The crew gathered for a simple meal of salted fish and bread, the lanterns casting small pools of gold across the deck. From the shore came the sound of the tide breathing in and out, and above them the first stars began to appear. When darkness settled fully, Elowen found herself drawn to the bow. The water still glowed faintly around the hull, though more softly now, as if the energy from earlier in the day had begun to rest. She leaned over, watching the shapes of small fish pass below like moving sparks. A faint voice reached her then, not from the ship, but from across the water, near the edge of the forest. It was the same melody she had heard in the clearing, drifting on the night air, each note rising and fading with perfect clarity. She turned toward the sound and saw, just at the water's edge, a flicker of light. It wasn't a torch. It moved too smoothly, too softly, glowing a pale silver white. It glided between the trees, pausing now and then, as if waiting. Elowen glanced back toward the others on deck, but no one else seemed to notice. She felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. Not an urge of impulse, but a quiet certainty, as though this was not a moment to ignore. By the time she looked again, the light had begun to retreat deeper into the trees. It lingered just long enough for her to know she could follow it, if she chose. And in that moment, the line between caution and curiosity began to blur. Elowen stood at the bow for a long moment, her hands resting on the railing, the night air cool against her skin. The light in the forest glimmered again, just enough to confirm it hadn't been a trick of her eyes. It pulsed faintly like a heartbeat, then drifted deeper between the trees. The melody that accompanied it was steady, unhurried, and impossibly clear over the gentle sounds of the tide. She stepped back from the rail and glanced toward the deck. Most of the crew were still gathered near the galley, voices low, their attention on their mugs and the soft glow of the lanterns. Captain Barrow sat apart, speaking quietly with Elias, both men deep in discussion over the folded map between them. None of them seemed aware of what was happening on the shore. Moving with care, Elowen descended the gangplank to the longboat that still bobbed against the Selkie's side. The rope that tethered it to the ship creaked faintly as she untied it, lowering herself onto the worn wooden seat. The water was calm, and the oars made little sound as she rowed toward the bay's edge. Every few strokes she paused to look up, making sure the light was still there. The closer she came to the shore, the clearer the melody became. It had no words, at least none she could recognize, but it carried the kind of rhythm that suggested meaning, like a language that spoke directly to the senses rather than the mind. She beached the longboat on the cool sand and stepped onto the island. The forest's edge loomed just ahead, its canopy silvered by the faint light of the moon. The glowing figure, if it could be called that, lingered between the trees, waiting. When she drew near, it turned and moved deeper inland, its light spilling across the forest floor in soft, shifting patterns. Elowen followed. The path was not one she had walked before, and it twisted quickly away from the bay, weaving between wide roots and narrow streams that glinted like dark glass. The air here felt different, warmer, yet somehow lighter, as though she were climbing higher, though her steps remained level. The figure never moved too quickly. It would drift ahead, pause until she drew close, then continue on. From time to time it passed near the silver-threaded vines that hung between the trees, and the faint chime of their touch would weave itself into the melody. After what felt like an hour, though she could not be certain, they reached another clearing. This one was smaller than the stone circle, but at its centre stood a single monolith, taller than a man and smooth as river rock. Its surface shimmered faintly, not with reflected light, but from within, as though the stone itself was alive. The figure stopped beside the monolith and turned toward her. For the first time, Elowen could see that it had a shape that suggested a person, though it was blurred at the edges, as if the light resisted being bound to a single form. The melody softened until it was only a hum, then faded altogether. Elowen stepped closer to the stone. Symbols covered its surface, the same looping lines she had seen carved into the trees near the bay, but here they were sharper, clearer, as though they had been renewed countless times. She reached out, hesitant, and let her fingers brush the cool surface. A rush of sensation filled her mind. Not images exactly, but impressions. The smell of rain on unfamiliar soil, the sound of waves against cliffs she had never seen, the warmth of firelight in a place far older than the books she had read. For a moment, she felt she was standing in many places at once, each layered over the other like the translucent pages of a map. She stepped back, her breath quick. The figure stood unmoving, its light pulsing faintly, almost in rhythm with her own heartbeat. Then it gestured toward the monolith, not with a hand, but with a shift in its glow, a subtle inclination that seemed to ask her to remember what she had just felt. Before she could speak, the figure's light dimmed slightly. It began to drift back toward the trees, retracing the path they had taken. Elowen followed, still shaken, her thoughts scattered between wonder and a quiet sense of warning. When they reached the edge of the forest near the bay, the figure stopped. For a moment, the light lingered in the air, brighter than before, then it folded inward and was gone, leaving only the dark shapes of the trees against the moonlit sky. Elowen turned toward the water. The Selkie floated in the distance, her lanterns steady and warm. The journey back across the bay felt longer than it had before, and when she climbed quietly onto the deck, she found the ship still as she had left it. No one had noticed she was gone, or, if they had chosen not to say. Elowen woke before dawn, her thoughts still tangled in the images and sensations from the monolith. The memory of that layered vision lingered as vivid as the salt in the air. She rose quietly, pulling her coat around her, and stepped onto the deck. The bay lay in a half light, the water smooth and reflecting the first pale hints of morning. The forest beyond the shore stood in shadow, the silver threads of the trees barely visible in the dimness. She expected to find the deck empty, but Elias was already there, leaning on the rail and looking toward the island. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, his eyes searching hers in a way that made her wonder if he knew where she'd been the night before. "You went inland," he said, not as a question, but a statement. She hesitated, then nodded. There was something. It led me there. Elias's expression shifted, not to surprise, but to something more cautious. "Describe it." She told him about the light, the path through the forest, the small clearing with the monolith. She described the carvings and the way the stone seemed to glow from within. And then she tried as best she could to explain the sensation, the overlapping impressions of places she had never seen, the feeling of standing in more than one moment at once. When she finished, Elias was silent for a long time. Finally, he said, "That matches part of a story I've read, one that doesn't appear in any of the merchant accounts or navigation logs. It comes from a single record written by someone who claimed to have lived on Gwyndral for a time. They spoke of stones that hold memory, not just of this place, but of all the paths that lead to it." Elowen glanced back toward the forest. "Then what I saw, it wasn't just a vision." "No," he said quietly. "You were shown something, perhaps something meant for you in particular." Before she could reply, the sound of boots on the deck announced Captain Barrow. He joined them, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to decide soon," he said without preamble, "whether we press further inland or take what we've seen and leave before the weather turns." The words sat heavily between them. The bay was calm now, but clouds were gathering in the distance, their edges faintly bruised with colour. Barrow's voice carried the weight of a man who had no desire to linger in a place that played by rules he could not predict. Elias answered first. "There's more here. I'm certain of it. The figure we saw in the clearing, Elowen's encounter, it's leading somewhere. I think the heart of the island lies further in." Barrow's gaze moved to Elowen. "And you? What do you think?" She felt the question pull at both her fear and her curiosity. "If we leave now, we'll never know what's there. And I don't think this place will let us find it twice." Barrow studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. "We'll go, but we keep our distance from anything we can't understand. Curiosity doesn't keep a man alive at sea." Preparations began immediately. Supplies were divided into smaller packs, ropes and climbing gear checked. The crew moved with the brisk precision of men who wanted the work done quickly. By midday, the air was heavy with the scent of rain, though no drops had yet fallen. They landed on the shore once more, this time with Elias leading and Barrow close behind. The forest swallowed them almost at once, the light thinning into soft green shadows. The silver-threaded vines seemed brighter now, as though they sensed their passing, each one releasing a faint chime when brushed. The path Elias chose led them away from the bay and deeper into the island's interior. The ground began to slope upward, the trees thinning in places to reveal glimpses of distant ridges. Now and then they passed signs of deliberate shaping, a stone step half buried in moss, a row of trees aligned so evenly they could not have grown so by chance. After hours of walking, they reached a rise where the forest opened into a high plateau. From here, Elowen could see much of the island's heart, a vast expanse of green broken by glints of water and darker swaths of forest. But her gaze was drawn to one place in particular. Far ahead, rising above the canopy, was a structure of pale stone, its lines too precise to be natural. Elias followed her gaze. "That," he said quietly, "is where we're going." Barrow said nothing, but Elowen saw his jaw tighten as he studied the distant shape. The wind shifted then, carrying with it a faint sound, not the hum of the clearing or the melody of the night before, but something lower, slower and more resonant. It seemed to come from the direction of the pale structure, each note pulsing through the air like the tolling of a bell deep underwater. No one spoke as they began the descent from the plateau, the sound following them, steady and patient as if marking their approach. The descent from the plateau was slower than their climb had been. The ground was uneven, the path narrowed by jutting roots and sudden drops hidden beneath the undergrowth. The sound from the distant structure, that deep, resonant toll seemed to grow clearer with each step, though it still felt more like something heard in the bones than in the ears. The forest changed as they moved lower. The trunks grew wider, their bark darkened almost to black, and the silver-threaded vines were replaced by broad leaves with a faint iridescent sheen. Here and there, clusters of white flowers hung in heavy blooms, their petals trembling as though stirred by a breath they could not feel. The air was warmer, heavier, and carried the faint scent of something metallic. They crossed a stream where the water ran so clear that the stones beneath it seemed magnified. Tiny fish darted away from their shadows, leaving ripples that shimmered with faint blue light. Elias paused here, crouching to study the water. "There's a pattern to it," he murmured, tracing lines in the damp earth. "The streams, they run toward the heart of the island, but they branch in such a way that they could also be guiding lines." Barrow frowned. "Guiding us to what?" Elias didn't look up. "The place where all these waters meet." He straightened, wiping his hands. "And I'd wager it's where that sound is coming from." They pressed on. Hours passed without any sign of other people, yet Elowen could not shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't the same as when they'd first encountered the cloaked figure in the clearing. This was subtler, like a quiet awareness just beyond her line of sight, not threatening, but constant. Once, she caught movement high in the trees, a shift of shadow that might have been a bird, though the branches didn't sway. By late afternoon, the forest thinned again, opening into a broad expanse of grassland. The ground was soft underfoot, the grass a muted gold that swayed gently even without wind. And there, at the far end of the open stretch, the structure rose above the horizon. It was larger now, and its form clearer. A tiered shape, wide at the base and narrowing toward the top, built from pale stone blocks that caught what little light filtered through the clouds. Its surface was weathered, but the lines of its construction were precise, each layer perfectly aligned. From its highest point came the steady resonance they had been hearing all day, a tone that seemed to pulse through the air in waves. As they approached, Elowen noticed that the grass gave way to a path of flat, fitted stones, some cracked but still firmly in place. Moss grew thick along their edges, but the path itself felt deliberate, as though it had been tended long after its makers had gone. The base of the structure loomed before them, each stone massive enough that she could not imagine how it had been moved. Along its face ran a series of shallow carvings, not like the looping lines she had seen on the monolith, but sharper, more angular shapes arranged in repeating patterns. The air here was cooler again, touched with the faint scent of rain, though the sky above remained unbroken. They climbed the first tier, the stone worn smooth under their boots. The sound grew louder, vibrating faintly through the surface beneath their feet. On the second tier, they found what seemed to be shallow basins carved into the stone, each one filled with water so still that it mirrored the sky perfectly. Elias bent over one and touched the surface. The ripples that spread out carried a faint light, like a reflection of the glowing water they had seen in the bay. On the third tier, they reached a wide platform. From here, the view stretched out over the forest and grassland, all the way to the dark line of cliffs they had sailed past. And at the centre of the platform stood the source of the sound, a single tall column of stone, narrower than the monolith Elowen had touched, but more intricately carved. It was surrounded by a circle of smaller stones, each angled toward the column's base. The carvings on the central pillar glowed faintly, their light pulsing in perfect time with the deep tone that filled the air. Elias stepped forward cautiously. This is a marker," he said softly. "Not just for direction, for alignment. It's part of a larger system." He looked up at the sky, then back at the carvings. "I think it's tied to the movement of the stars." Barrow stayed at the edge of the circle, his eyes scanning the forest below. "Whatever it is, we're not alone here." Elowen followed his gaze. Far in the distance, at the edge of the grassland, she saw them. Figures, faint in the dim light, moving with deliberate steps toward the structure. They were too far to make out clearly, but their movement was unhurried, as if they knew exactly where to find them. The figures drew closer with a measured grace, their shapes gradually taking form against the muted gold of the grassland. There were 6 of them. 6 of them, each clothed in garments of pale layered fabric that moved like water with their steps. The cloth caught the light in shifting tones, silver one moment, pale green the next, blending seamlessly with the landscape. None carried visible weapons, yet there was an undeniable authority in the way they approached. The sound from the stone column did not change, but Elowen felt it deepen in her chest, as if acknowledging their arrival. Elias stepped slightly forward, his hand resting on the strap of his satchel, while Barrow's stance remained watchful, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. When the group reached the base of the platform, they paused. For a moment, they simply stood there, looking up at the three strangers before them. Then one stepped ahead, taller than the rest, with a hood drawn back to reveal hair the colour of ash and skin, marked by fine pale lines that almost resembled the carvings on the stone. When this figure spoke, their voice was calm and low, carrying in a way that seemed untouched by the distance. The language was the same as that of the cloaked messenger in the forest clearing, a fluid, winding speech that seemed to flow around the edges of comprehension. Elias listened intently. "They're asking why we've come," he murmured to Elowen and Barrow without taking his eyes off the speaker. Not in a hostile way, more like a test. He answered in careful, deliberate phrases, not in their language, but with the steady tone of someone offering truth without embellishment. He spoke of the map, of the old records, of their search for Gwyndral. And then, after a pause, he added, "We wish to understand, not to take." The tall figure considered this in silence. Then they ascended the platform steps, the others following. As they entered the circle around the central pillar, the glow in the carvings shifted, not brighter, but more intricate, as if threads of light were weaving together in response to their presence. One of the newcomers stepped to the pillar and placed a palm flat against its surface. The deep resonance changed, forming a sequence of tones rather than a single note, and the glow in the carvings began to trace upward, spiraling toward the top. Elias's eyes widened. "They're unlocking something," he whispered. A moment later, the entire platform seemed to tremble, not from force, but from an almost imperceptible shift in the air, like a sudden change in pressure. The smaller stones surrounding the pillar lit up, their angled faces casting light toward the centre. The sound grew layered now, like many voices humming in unison. The tall figure turned toward Elowen and gestured for her to step forward. The motion was not commanding, but inviting, as though this moment had been prepared for her alone. She moved slowly, her pulse loud in her ears, until she stood before the pillar. When she placed her hand against the stone, the glow surged. It was not blinding, but warm, as if sunlight had been captured inside the rock. The carvings beneath her palm pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, and then the vision came, not as chaotic impressions this time, but as a clear sequence. She saw the island as it might have been centuries ago, its cliffs unweathered, its forests younger but no less vibrant. She saw gatherings at this very platform, figures in garments like those before her now, standing in precise patterns as the stars shifted overhead. She saw the pillar aligning with constellations, the light from the carving streaming into the sky like a beacon. And beneath it all, she sensed something deeper, a connection that reached far beyond the island. Pathways, like the glowing grooves in the forest clearing, stretching outward across the sea and into places unknown. The pillar was not merely a marker, it was a link, one point in a vast, hidden network. When she drew her hand back, the glow softened and the tones faded to their original single note. The tall figure's gaze met hers, and in that look she felt the unspoken weight of what she had just been shown. The knowledge was a gift, but also a responsibility. Elias stepped closer. "What did you see?" he asked quietly. Elowen searched for the right words. "Not just where we are," she said at last, "where it connects." Below, at the edge of the grassland, more figures were gathering, their pale garments shifting in the wind. The island, it seemed, was no longer simply watching them. It was preparing for something. The gathering below the platform swelled until the grassland shimmered with movement. Dozens of figures stood in loose arcs, their presence neither hurried nor aggressive, yet carrying the gravity of an arrival long anticipated. Their garments caught the muted light in soft ripples, and the air seemed to thrum faintly with the same deep resonance that pulsed from the central pillar. Elias's gaze swept over them, measuring the scope of what this meant. "They knew we would come here," he murmured, more to himself than to Elowen or Barrow. Not by chance, by design. The tall figure who had first approached them stepped to the edge of the platform and lifted both hands. They found the pillar deepened, and the crowd below shifted, opening a clear path through their ranks. From this path emerged another presence, a figure older than the rest, leaning on a staff carved from a pale, weathered wood. At the staff's top was crowned with a shard of stone glowing faintly from within, identical to the one the cloaked messenger had placed in the grooves of the forest clearing. The elder climbed the steps unhurried, each footfall seeming to land in rhythm with the pillar's hum. Up close, Elowen could see that the fine, pale lines on their skin were deeper, like the weathered seams of ancient stone. When they spoke, their voice was lower and steadier than the others, carrying a weight that needed no volume. Elias listened intently, nodding once before turning to Elowen. "They ask if you were the one who touched the memory stone in the forest. They say it has been waiting for you." Elowen hesitated, then nodded. "I touched it," she said softly. The elder's gaze did not waver. They extended a hand toward her, palm up, open. In the stillness of that moment, she stepped forward and placed her own hand in theirs. The elder's fingers were warm, the skin smooth despite their age. Without a word, the elder guided her to stand directly before the pillar again. This time, they placed their own hand over hers against the stone. The carvings flared to life instantly, their light streaming outward into the smaller surrounding stones, then along the platform's edges. The sound changed again, resolving into a slow, rising sequence that sent a deep vibration through the ground. The crowd below shifted in unison, their heads bowing, their movements precise but unforced, as if following a ritual older than memory. Elowen felt the world narrow to a single thread, the touch of the elder's hand, the warmth of the stone beneath her palm, the pulse of light and sound building like a tide. Her thoughts emptied, replaced by an expanding awareness of the platform, of the island, of the sea that surrounded it. And then she saw it, not with her eyes, but with a clarity beyond vision. Lines of light stretching outward from Gwyndral in all directions, arcing across water and land alike. Some reached far into the distance until they vanished into darkness, others curved back to meet one another, forming patterns like constellations laid upon the earth. Along these lines she felt the presence of other places, islands, shores, cities, each marked by a faint but steady glow. When the elder released her hand, the vision faded slowly, like the last ripples of a stone dropped into water. She stepped back, unsteady but not afraid. The elder spoke again, and Elias translated. "They say you have been shown the map, not so you may follow it, but so you may remember it. The paths are not for all who come here. They are for those who will know when to walk them." Barrow, who had stood silent through the ritual, shifted his stance. "And what happens if others find this place? If they come looking for whatever this is?" The elder's gaze moved to him briefly before returning to Elowen. They spoke a single phrase that Elias did not translate at once. When he did, his voice was quiet. "They say the island decides who finds it, and once it is found, it decides who may leave." A hush followed. Far below, the crowd began to move again, breaking their formation but not dispersing. Instead, they seemed to be preparing, though for what? Elowen could not yet tell. The elder stepped back, inclining their head in a gesture that was both farewell and instruction. The tall figure who had first greeted them took their place, gesturing for the three of them to follow. Elias glanced at Elowen, his expression a mix of curiosity and caution, before they descended the steps together. As they left the platform, the deep resonance faded, replaced by the soft rustle of grass and the faint chime of the wind through unseen threads in the air. The path ahead curved toward the forest once more, but Elowen had the unmistakable sense that they were not being led back to the bay. They were being taken somewhere deeper, somewhere the island did not show to every visitor. The path wound through the tall golden grass until it met the shadow of the forest again, where the light dimmed and the air cooled. The tall figure who guided them moved without hesitation, each step finding a narrow way between roots and stones, as if following an invisible trail. Elias kept close behind, glancing often at the trees as though memorizing the turns, while Barrow's eyes swept their surroundings, his hand brushing the hilt of his knife in quiet habit. Elowen felt the forest's presence differently here. The silver-threaded vines were more abundant, draping from high branches in soft, glowing arcs. Their faint chiming rose and fell with the movement of the air, blending with a deeper tone that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the ground. The scent was richer now, moss and earth, but also something faintly floral, as if unseen blossoms opened in the shadows. After a time, the path sloped downward. The canopy broke in places, letting pale shafts of light spill across the mossy floor. Ahead, the sound of water began to emerge, not the restless rhythm of the sea, but a steady, resonant flow, deep and deliberate. They came to the mouth of a cavern, half hidden by the roots of an ancient tree. Water ran from it in a narrow stream, spilling over smooth stones into a pool where the surface shimmered faintly with its own inner glow. The figure gestured for them to follow and stepped inside. The cavern was taller than it first appeared, the walls smooth and faintly luminous, as though the stone itself carried a memory of light. The sound of the water deepened as they moved further in, becoming a low, constant note that vibrated faintly in Elowen's chest. After several bends, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber. Here, the ceiling arched high above, lined with thousands of the silver-threaded vines, their light cascading downward like strands of a frozen waterfall. At the centre of the chamber was a pool, so still it reflected the hanging lights perfectly, creating the illusion of an endless space above and below. Figures waited at the far edge of the pool, a smaller group than the one at the platform, but their garments were more intricately woven, marked with patterns that shifted subtly in the glow. One of them stepped forward, holding a shallow bowl carved from translucent stone. Within it was water unlike any Elowen had ever seen, dark as obsidian, yet shot through with threads of light that twisted and drifted like living things. The tall guide spoke briefly to the group, then turned to Elias and Elowen. Their voice was quiet, almost reverent. Elias translated in a whisper. "They say this is the source. All the streams on the island begin here, and every path, the ones you saw in your vision, is tied to it." The figure with the bowl stepped to the edge of the pool and knelt, lowering the vessel until it touched the water. The dark surface broke without a ripple, the glowing threads inside the bowl brightening as if awakened. They lifted it carefully, then rose and turned toward Elowen. Elias's translation was barely audible. "They are offering you the water." Elowen hesitated. "What will it do?" "They say," Elias continued slowly, "it will show you the first path, not on the island, beyond it." The bowl was light in her hands, the stone cool against her palms. The water within seemed to shift with its own slow current, the glowing threads bending toward her fingers as if drawn to her touch. She raised it to her lips. The taste was unlike anything she had known, not sweet, not bitter, but carrying the sensation of rain falling after a long drought, of salt carried on a wind from far away. The moment it touched her tongue, the chamber vanished. She stood on the deck of a ship, not the Selkie, but something older, its timbers dark with age. The horizon ahead was vast and cloudless, and in the distance faint shapes of other islands rose from the sea, each one crowned with a glimmer of light. Beneath the surface, she could see the glowing lines again, stretching from the island beneath her feet to each distant shore. The vision shifted, and she saw people moving along those lines, not walking, not sailing, but travelling in a way that defied her understanding, as though the space between points had been folded in on itself. Then, as quickly as it had come, the vision dissolved, and she was back in the cavern, the bowl still in her hands, the water within now dark and still. The figures watching her did not speak. The tall guide stepped forward, their gaze steady. Elias's voice was low when he translated. "They say the path you saw will come to you again when the time is right, and when it does, you will know which way to turn." Somewhere far above, beyond the weight of stone and earth, thunder rolled faintly, the first sign of the storm that had been gathering since they set foot on Gwyndral. The thunder above grew heavier, rolling in long, low waves that seemed to echo through the cavern's walls. The silver-threaded vines swayed gently, though no wind reached this deep. Elowen set the empty bowl back into the hands of the figure who had given it to her, feeling a subtle warmth linger in her palms, as if the water's touch had not fully left her. The tall guide motioned for them to follow once more. They crossed the chamber in silence, the still pool at the centre reflecting their movements like a second world. The way back through the tunnel felt shorter, though the sound of the water still hung in the air like a memory. When they emerged into the forest's dim light, the sky had deepened to a bruised grey, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Elias glanced upward. "We'll need to reach shelter before the storm breaks." The guide led them along a different path now, one that wound upward through a series of ridges. The forest thinned in places, giving them glimpses of the coastline far below, where the bay glowed faintly even in the gloom. In the distance, the Selkie rocked gently on the rising swells, its lanterns flickering against the deepening sky. It was then that Elowen noticed something strange. The storm seemed to be circling the island rather than sweeping directly over it. Bands of dark clouds swirled in the distance, their edges lit by flashes of lightning, yet above the island's heart the light remained soft, almost golden. Their climb ended at a ledge cut into the cliffside. Here stood a structure built from the same pale stone as the platform, though smaller, its walls half overgrown with vines. The doorway faced east, looking out toward the open sea. The interior was dry and cool, with a raised stone slab at its centre, surrounded by low carvings that mirrored the angular shapes Elowen had seen before. The guide stepped inside first, touching one of the carvings with the tips of their fingers. A faint light spread outward, tracing the lines until the entire slab was outlined in soft luminescence. Elias's voice was hushed when he spoke. "They say this is a place for travellers, those who leave and those who return." Barrow raised a brow. "Return? You're telling me people come back here after finding it?" Elias translated the question, and the guide's answer was brief. "Only when called." The word lingered in Elowen's mind. She turned toward the doorway, watching the horizon where the storm's edge moved in slow, deliberate arcs. There was something in that movement that felt purposeful, as if the weather itself was shaped by the same will that had led them inland. As night approached, the figures who had escorted them began to leave, slipping away into the forest with quiet bows. Only the tall guide remained, standing near the entrance like a sentinel. The hum of the pillar's resonance was gone now, replaced by the softer, rhythmic sound of the tide far below. Elias sat near the slab, flipping through his notebook. "We've learned more in these days than I thought possible, but I can't shake the feeling this was just the first chapter." Elowen didn't answer immediately. She was watching the bay where the Selkie's lanterns had begun to blur in the rain. In her mind's eye, she could still see the vision from the water in the cavern, the arcs of light stretching outward, the other islands marked like stars on a dark map, each one waiting. When she finally spoke, her voice was low. "We came here looking for a place, but I think we found a question instead." Elias looked up at her, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Then we'll have to decide if we're ready to hear the answer." The first drops of rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady, their sound mingling with the slow breath of the sea. Somewhere deep within the forest, faint and almost lost to the wind, a note of that same wordless melody rose once more, the one that had led her from the bay on that first night. And as the island settled into the hush of the storm, Elowen knew with a certainty she could not explain that Gwyndral had not finished with them. Not yet.